His Majesty's Prison, Wormwood Scrubs, in 1916, a prison full of conscientious objectors, by Dr. Francis Hurd. Britain had always relied on voluntary military service, but by late 1915 it was apparent that insufficient numbers were coming forward, and the government decided to introduce conscription for unmarried men between 18 and 41 years old. This was later extended to married men as well. The Military Service Act became law on the 2nd of March 1916. The government had recognised that some exemptions would be needed, for instance for men working in vital industries such as farming, but as the draft act made its way through Parliament, a group of MPs argued successfully for an additional conscience clause which extended exemption to men who demonstrated a principled objection to military service. In order to obtain any form of exemption, men had to appear before a local tribunal and argue their case. Partial exemption enrolled men in the army to perform non-combatant tasks such as stretcher bearing, hospital portering and various manual jobs. A new army unit, the Non-Combatant Corps, was created, which the government expected to absorb the majority of conscientious objectors. I will be referring to conscientious objectors as COs from here on. Alternative service exempted men from the armed forces on condition that they undertook work of national importance, such as serving in one of the voluntary ambulance services like the Friends Ambulance Unit. Absolute exemption completely absolved men from the terms of the Act. Two factors combined to produce significant problems for the government and the army. Firstly, local tribunals' interpretations of what kind of exemption was or should be available varied. Some were reluctant to grant any exemptions because they saw recruiting as their primary function. Others refused to grant absolute exemption on principle because they believed men would cooperate once they were sent to the army. Some thought they had no authority to grant absolute exemption. Secondly, the government had seriously underestimated how many COs would seek absolute exemption and, if forced into the army when they failed to obtain it, would refuse to obey any military command, such as donning a uniform. These COs came to be known as absolutists. It became clear that something needed to be done with these men, if only to relieve the army of their burden. The government therefore allowed the COs to be transferred to civilian prisons. About 6,000 men were imprisoned. Men refused military service for either religious or political reasons, and sometimes a mixture of both. Members of the left-wing Independent Labour Party and the Society of Friends, Quakers, were the two largest groups, but there were also other religious denominations which believed in pacifism, such as the International Bible Students Association, later renamed Jehovah's Witnesses, some anarchists and radical socialists, and individuals who felt the war was wrong, even though their religious or political background might suggest they'd support it. For instance, there are only 4 known Jewish COs. In August 1916, it was decided that all convicted COs would be sent to Wormwood Scrubs in West London. Here, a central tribunal would interview each absolutist and decide whether he was genuine in his conscientious objection. On arriving at the prison, the CO might be feeling quite exhilarated by his decision, but this would not last. They had to strip off and give up every possession except their glasses, false teeth or surgical appliance, and were then medically examined. The focus of this examination was succinctly described by one CO as shirt up and trousers down. They were then issued with prison uniforms, white with black arrows for ordinary prisoners, but black with white arrows for court-martial prisoners like the COs. Clothing and shoes were often too big or too small. In addition, prison laundering was inefficient, and prisoners were sometimes given underwear visibly stained by urine, feces or blood. Prisoners wore a large metal badge on the left breast with their cell number, which you can see in this picture. So D254 was occupying cell 54 on the second floor of D Wing. Prisoners were addressed only by their number, never by their name. The regime at Wormwood Scrubs was typical of contemporary prisons, based around the use of solitary confinement, and any communication between prisoners was forbidden. They were only allowed to say, "Yes, sir," to the warders. The CO Arthur Creech Jones wrote, "You meet your friends and you dare not speak. You must live in complete isolation. Never laugh, smile, hum, whistle, sing or speak in case you're punished." All prisoners, whatever their crime, were in solitary confinement for the first month after their arrival, except for 40 minutes daily exercise. The CO Williamson Mason described lying awake, listening to another man shouting in sheer terror and despair through being alone in the dark with the terrors of his mind, screaming out, oh God, someone talk to me, say anything, only for God's sake talk to me." Some absolutist COs endured solitary confinement throughout their imprisonment. Clifford Allen, a journalist, was sentenced to 112 days of hard labour with solitary confinement in Wormwood Scrubs in August 1916, which was immediately followed by a further 83 days. He later wrote, "I think the greatest torture of enforced and perpetual silence is the never-ceasing consciousness of thinking. You cannot stop thinking for an instant, and if you seem to, it is only to listen intently to the beating of your heart drumming in your ears." Breakfast was bread and gruel, oatmeal boiled in water. Lunch was bread and porridge without salt or sugar, and dinner was more bread and gruel. "So hungry were we," the Quaker CO Stephen Hobhouse wrote, "that I have seen many a root grabbed from the soil surreptitiously while we were at exercise." COs were sentenced to hard labour at Wormwood Scrubs, sewing mailbags from large pieces of sacking for 10 hours a day while sitting on a 3-legged stool. After the first month, prisoners were allowed to do this work in one of the prison workshops. If they had not done so before during exercise, when prisoners followed each other in single file and whispered to the man in front, or in the chapel when they sang conversations to each other during hymns, the workshop was where men learned the technique of prison communication. Stephen Hobhouse explained that talking without detection in a special kind of whisper becomes a kind of fine art. After the first month, prisoners got a slightly improved diet with a little meat on 3 days a week, and were permitted 4 photographs in their cell. After 8 weeks, they could write and receive 1 short letter and have 1 visit per month of 20 minutes, speaking to their visitor through a thick grill. After 12 weeks, 2 letters and 2 visits were permitted. These privileges could, of course, all be revoked at the whim of a warder. A Quaker meeting for prisoners and the appointment of a Quaker chaplain both seem to have happened very soon after the arrival of the first Quaker COs in April 1916. Subsequently, Quaker meetings and chaplains were established at other prisons during the war and continue to this day. Meetings are always open to anyone who wishes to attend, and it was therefore possible for non-Quaker prisoners to take part. Those attending a meeting sit in a circle, thus seeing each other's faces, speak as they feel moved to, and shake hands at the end. Altogether, therefore, this offered an extraordinary experience for the isolated prisoners. By 1918, Wormwood Scrubs had the largest meeting in London. Quakers also joined prisoners' friends and family to sing hymns on Sunday evenings outside the prison, as well as carols at Christmas. Most of the COs eventually agreed to go to one of the government work camps, which were supposed to occupy them with work of national importance, varying from farm labour to quarrying. Those who refused to do this, or who the Central Tribunal refused to accept as genuine COs, were returned to the army, refused to obey any military order, were court-martialed again and returned to prison. In 1916, Wormwood Scrubs also received 2 other unusual groups of prisoners. 15 army officers were court-martialed for gross indecency with a male person, that is, consensual homosexual activity, and were given prison sentences varying from 6 months to 2 years with hard labour before being sent back to the army to serve as ordinary soldiers. The Scrubs was also used to house Irish prisoners arrested after the Easter Rising. At first they were treated as prisoners of war, which meant they could wear their own clothes, were allowed to smoke, and didn't have to undertake the prison work. Attempts were then made to conscript them, which the Irishmen resisted. They were eventually sent back to Ireland. In 1922, The Quaker Stephen Hobhouse and the socialist Fenner Brockway, who'd both been imprisoned in Wormwood Scrubs, published their monumental work, English Prisons Today, based not only on their own experiences, but with hundreds of anonymised contributions from former prisoners and prison staff. That is still by far the most detailed account of the operation of English prisons ever published. A month after its publication, all prison governors were instructed to allow conversation between prisoners at labour and exercise and between prisoners and warders. A few months later, the Home Office ended the use of solitary confinement at the start of every convict sentence. These were the reforms prisoners had most passionately desired. Many further reforms, such as the abolition of capital punishment, sought by Hobhouse and Brockway, took longer to come, and others they advocated have still not been made. English prisons today remain sadly as relevant as it was 100 years ago.